The last time we did these rankings, it was about 3 weeks ago, and there's been a lot of defenses that have been rising and falling over that time, and now we're exactly 1 week away for fantasy playoffs. So this calls for an updated rankings for the fantasy defenses for the fantasy playoffs. So just make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now getting into our first tier right here, we've got the Bills defense at number 1. Now the Bills defense, they've risen up quite a bit. Like from the last time that we actually did these rankings, the Bills defense have definitely improved. And the Bills defense, the good thing about the Bills is that consistently over the year, they've always been able to get the turnovers. The turnovers and the big plays is what they've been able to capitalize on. 13 interceptions, 12 forced fumbles, 11 fumbles recovered, and 2 defensive touchdowns over that time. Now the problem that I've had with the Bills defense over this entire season has been their lack of sack volume. They only have 29 sacks through 12 games. That is not a very good sack number. That's not even 3 sacks per game they're averaging. So the Bills defense, I've definitely got my issues with them. With the way that they're playing just over the last several weeks indicates that they're a team on the rise. We obviously know their offense is running really well right now, and the way they played the 49ers defense on Sunday night was absolutely fantastic. Now here's what they've got coming up. Obviously the Detroit matchup in week 15 is a really tough one. There's no way around that. The way the Lions offense is able to play right now it's almost unstoppable. Like they not only are scoring tons of points, but they don't turn the ball over. They play really clean football. Now you've got the New England Patriots and then the Jets, and those are both at home games. Those teams are both done. It's a disgrace. What the Jets are doing right now is embarrassing. Aaron Rodgers is throwing interceptions every game, and Drake May is obviously throwing picks every game as well, and they're just not very talented. So those last 2 matchups right there, if you can make it in week 15 with a different defense, don't advise you to play the Bills defense when they're playing the Detroit Lions in week 15. But if you can get past that defense in week 15 and then just ride it out with them week 16 and 17, you should be getting about 15 to 12 fantasy points per game just from the Bills defense alone over those final 2 weeks. Now getting into number 2, the Broncos defense at number 2 here. And listen, the Broncos defense has obviously been fantastic the entire year. Coming into the Monday night game where they play the Cleveland Browns in week 13, their defense is the number 3 defense in fantasy football, 9.4 fantasy points per game, and that's because they're actually the exact opposite of the Bills, because they actually don't force too many turnovers, 9 interceptions, 6 fumble recoveries, but they're getting after your quarterback so consistently. 44 sacks through 12 games, 44, and again, that's not counting the game on Monday night versus the Cleveland Browns, which maybe you're watching it afterwards. They added another 5 or 6 sacks to that total. That's the point here, is that their defense consistently is getting after the quarterback. Now, the other strong thing that the Broncos have had on their side is their schedule for the majority of the year has been very, very beatable. And that doesn't really change coming into the playoffs. Now, they play the Indianapolis Colts in week 15. That matchup is awesome just because of the fact that Anthony Richardson is still not playing clean football. The Colts offense is still one of the most turnover-prone offenses in the entire league. So that's a great matchup. The Chargers one is iffy because the Chargers definitely are not they're not turning the ball over a ton, but they also don't score a bunch as well, and J.K. Dobbins being out, that totally affects the way their offense will be able to perform. And then the Cincinnati game is also a toss-up, because the Bengals can put up points, but by this time, I actually have a feeling a couple things will be at play. Number 1, the Bengals don't play the cleanest of football. They make a couple mistakes per game offensively. Number 2, I think by this time the Bengals will be officially out of playoff contention, so they may be hanging up Burrow and Chase for the season already. That is a definite possibility here, but the other factor I like here is that they're coming into week 15 off a bye week. They have not had their bye week yet. They're coming into a week 14 bye after this Cleveland Browns game on Monday night, and that means that they're going to be refreshed and ready to go, and already they're still really healthy. They're one of the healthiest teams coming into December right now. I really like the Broncos defense at 2, and then the Chargers defense also at number 3. Listen, the Chargers defense has also been pretty fantastic the entire year. They're the number 5 defense on the year, averaging 9 fantasy points per game. Very similarly to the Denver Broncos, where they're getting after your quarterback consistently, 36 sacks on the year. They've got a little bit more turnovers, 13 interceptions and 4 forced fumbles, but they're still not that much more turnover happy than the Denver Broncos are, for example. Now, what I really like about the Chargers defense is in a game where I thought that they would have issues with the Atlanta Falcons, because the Falcons have been a pretty solid offense that's really explosive over the majority of the year. Well, they actually come in there and they actually forced 4 interceptions from Kirk Cousins. Is it because Kirk sucks now, or is it because the Chargers defense is good? I think it's a mix of both here for sure. And the good thing, again, with the Chargers is they get good matchups here. They play the Tampa Bay Bucks in Week 15. Not exactly the best matchup right here, but the Bucks do turn the ball over. So I do like that potential here. You've got the Broncos defense in Week 16. Again, toss-up matchup here. Broncos have been playing cleaner, and they also are putting up more points. So that's the reason why they're one spot below the Broncos, because I believe the Broncos probably end up winning that game. And then the New England Patriots, Week 17. That's a great matchup right there. So 2 out of these 3 matchups, I actually kind of like, because Tampa Bay does turn the ball over. So I really think that the Chargers defense, just the way that they just beat the brakes of the Atlanta Falcons, I really do like their defense in Tier 1. Now dropping down to Tier 2, we've got the Vikings defense at number 4. Now with the Vikings defense, obviously what needs to be said is that their defense has been absolutely fantastic this year. They're the number 1 defense in fantasy football through 13 weeks. Their defense is averaging 10.9 fantasy points per game, almost 11. They're getting after the quarterback, 39 sacks. They're getting turnovers galore, 18 interceptions, and 6 fumble recoveries. Like, they're turning the ball over so much because Brian Flores is a great defensive coordinator. And ironically, like, some of their personnel is good, but not all of their personnel is good. And they're just getting after you because Brian Flores knows how to coach a defense here. And the Vikings defense, they get some decent matchups here. They get Chicago in Week 15. Now, obviously, they have already fired Shane Waldron, the offensive coordinator, and their offense has looked better since then. But they also fired Matt Eberflus, the head coach, who I think it was way past time to do that. He was a dead man walking from like Week 6 on. But with the Chicago Bears, this may be just at a point where the Bears play like good for the next week or 2. But then after that, like the glam of the interim coach wears off, and then they end up just losing pretty badly for the next several games. Then they get the Seahawks. That's a great matchup because the Seahawks consistently turn the ball over. Geno has had a very turnover-prone year, and they also are just they're a pretty sloppy offense right now. Then they get Green Bay. That's a matchup that I think is honestly not as bad as it sounds. Green Bay obviously can put up points, and they did the first time, but in that first game against Green Bay, where Green Bay put up about 30 points, they actually had a pretty good fantasy game, 10 points depending on your format. So with the Vikings defense, they're turnover prone. They get after your quarterback. I don't see a bad matchup in here. The only reason they're down a tier is because I don't particularly love the matchups versus Chicago and Green Bay. But I do like the Vikings defense overall. Then we've got the Packers defense at number 5 here. The Packers defense is also been a really largely good fantasy defense. Now, the difference here between the Packers defense and the Vikings defense is the Packers defense is a lot more streaky. You could see the game log on the screen right now. They've had plenty of games in excess of 12 fantasy points. Like, they've had some big, massive weeks. They've also had some stinkers too. They've had a couple 4-point games, 5-point games, some 2-point games in there. Like, their defense is definitely capable of giving up tons of points. They're a bend but don't break defense, but they also force, again, a lot of turnovers. 32 sacks, so they get after your quarterback. 11 interceptions and 12 fumble recoveries. Like, this is a turnover-happy defense right here. Their personnel is definitely week to week good because Jair Alexander's been in and out of the lineup. Xavier McKinney's having a great year as a safety, though. And I think that the Packers defense is ultimately just getting after the quarterback and getting turnovers so much that it doesn't particularly matter exactly when Jair Alexander plays, for example. Now, when you look at their matchups here, Seattle and New Orleans, those are great first 2 weeks. Seattle, obviously, like I just said, very turnover prone. I like that matchup a lot. New Orleans, I like that matchup, but I will say this. New Orleans is playing better football lately, and since they fired their head coach, Dennis Allen, they put up much better efforts. So defenses have not had as much success over the last several weeks versus the Saints as they were, 2 months ago. So I think the Saints is a little bit of a sketchy play at this point, but I still like it because the Packers defense has been so good. And then again, they get that Vikings matchup, who the Vikings do turn the ball over sometimes. So ultimately, that's what keeps the Packers inside of top 5. Their defense forces turnovers, and that last matchup against Minnesota, they turn the ball over offensively. I think the Packers end up being a pretty good play as well. And then the Lions defense at number 6 to round out this particular tier. The Lions defense is obviously on a freaking heater. They actually, the one bad game they've had over like the last month was that game against the Chicago Bears. on Thanksgiving. And it wasn't even a bad game, like 6 to 8 points depending on your format, because they got 5 sacks on Caleb Williams. So that's why, I don't see the Lions not being a top 10 defense in the fantasy playoffs. The way that they're playing right now, getting after the quarterback so aggressively, getting turnovers so aggressively, they're so opportunistic, and it's just an aggressive team culture that I don't think a matchup particularly matters. So when I'm looking at teams like Buffalo, obviously, again, there's no way around this. This is not a good matchup. Buffalo has been playing really clean football offensively, and I just think that the way that they're playing overall, they're sort of like the AFC Lions. They're playing so good. They're steamrolling certain teams. I think that they absolutely could be in a shootout here. I don't like that matchup. But then you get Chicago again. I think that they'll get after the Caleb Williams just like they did the first time. Because no offensive coaching change is going to change the fact that Caleb Williams has an atrocious offensive line blocking for him. Nothing's going to change that. So I think that Chicago matchup's good. And then the San Francisco 49ers matchup, that's a good one too. The 49ers are done. Their offense is in shambles. Their entire team is in shambles. Offensive line is in shambles. Christian McCaffrey now probably done for the year. As of the time of this filming, we don't know for sure, but he's probably done. Brock Purdy making mistakes all day long. The receiving core in disarray. So they've got great matchups, especially at the end. And I think that the way the Lions defense has just been playing, you cannot have them outside of the top 10 if you believe in any sort of momentum for any particular team. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got the Cardinals defense at number 7. I think that the Cardinals defense, I've been talking about them for months now. I think their defense has been very underrated in fantasy for the majority of the year. They're the defense number 11 right now in fantasy and are averaging 7.7 fantasy points per game. So obviously they've had some good ones and they've also had some stinkers in there as well. They're not a super high ceiling defense as you can see on the screen, but they've consistently been pretty good the entire year. That's why they're not super high on the list, because they're not exactly getting massive games, but they've been very consistent. And I think that when you look at the turnovers they force, that's my ultimate problem here. They've got 6 interceptions and 7 fumbles recovered. That's only 13 turnovers on the year for the Cardinals defense. Not exactly fantastic. But again, I look at these matchups here, and I think to myself, I don't see a particularly bad one in this group. New England is obviously great. Carolina, I will say this, playing better football for sure. Their offense is no slouch. They're actually building a real culture there in Carolina right now, so I don't particularly love that matchup quite like I love the New England Patriots and possibly the Rams. The Rams offense can obviously move the ball and get points, but they also turn the ball over. Stafford's getting sacked a ton this year, and the first time they played the Los Angeles Rams, they had 17 to 19 fantasy points depending on your particular format. Why is that? Because they've actually played really well against their division this year, and their defense, again, is playing physical football. They're getting after the quarterback with sacks, but they're not getting as many turnovers here. That's why they're down here, but the matchups and the potential that they have as a defense to be a really solid, consistent play keeps it in number 7. And when I look at the Eagles at number 8, it's depressing. I like the Eagles defense. Their defense has gotten night and day better from the first month of the season. In September, I didn't think the Eagles defense would be sniffing top 12. They're a top 12 defense right now, averaging 7.6 fantasy points per game. And again, their defense is getting after the quarterback, 36 sacks. They're getting turnovers more often over the last month than they were over the first month and a half of the season. So their defense has definitely come on with their young players on the back end, Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell in the secondary, and then Vic Fangio's just kind of brought it all together in the front 7 as well. So this defense is looking better. Now they get Pittsburgh in week 15. Honestly, that's a toss-up matchup. Russell could come out and play really well like he did against the Bengals, but I also think that there's a possibility they hold them to like 5 field goals. Then you get Washington. The first time versus Washington was not their best, wasn't their worst, but it wasn't their best. Washington's fighting for playoff seeding right now, so they're going to put up a fight. Then you get Dallas, who is a good matchup here because Cooper Rush is turnover prone. So I want to rank the Eagles higher here, but I just can't end up doing that just based on the way they've played the last 3 months. Then you get the Colts defense at number 9 here, rounding out this tier. And again, the Colts defense was a little bit higher the last time I ranked these defenses in the playoffs because their schedule's so strong. Let's just get that out of the way. Denver, Tennessee, New York Giants. 2 of those on the road, 1 of them at home. They have 2, those last 2 ones should be theoretically awesome matchups. But you know what my problem with the Colts defense is? They're the defense number 14 on the year. They have not been bad. They've had several good games, and their schedule has really been strong this year on several weeks. The problem that I have is that they just played the Patriots and put up kind of a stinker for what that game should have been. But at the end of the day, like, that should have been a much better, much stronger performance than they just put up. But again, they get Tennessee, who is just so most of the time cold. Sometimes can get hot. It's a divisional opponent. I think the Colts will win. They're still fighting for playoff spot potentially. And then the Giants here. The Giants are in complete disarray. They're probably the most disgraceful franchise as of the time of this filming. They're in total disarray right now. So there's no way I can't see them being good in week 17. And that's ultimately what's kind of holding their spot right here at this point inside the top 10. Dropping down to our last tier, we've got the Bucs defense at number 10. Now, they rose up just a little bit, and it's not because of what they did against the Panthers, who, by the way, I got lots of flack for putting the Bucs defense outside of the top 12 in week 13 because they were playing the Panthers. Listen, Panthers are playing good football, and the Bucs defense has not been great in fantasy. That's a side note. That's neither here nor there. Those are minor details. But here's the deal with the Tampa Bay Bucs defense. Their defense is actually capable of hitting big plays. Like, if you look at turnovers, they're not getting tons of turnovers here. But what you've seen is some particular weeks, in a vacuum of a week, they can actually hit some big performances. Week 4 versus Philly, they had an 11-13 point depending on your format. Then you go to week 6 versus New Orleans, 17-point game. Then you look at their game versus the Giants in week 12. They had 10 points in fantasy depending on format again. So they definitely have the potential to do really well. And then you look at their playoff schedule here. Outside of the Chargers, they've got 2 good matchups, again, theoretically. Dallas and Carolina. Carolina, by that time, I'm kind of curious to see what they'll look like because they're not fighting for really anything other than pride and culture building at this point. So how long does it last? I don't know. But they definitely have that game against Dallas, who, whether they try or not, they're going to turn the ball over. So the Bucs defense, I still don't look at them as a top tier play. That's why they're down here at the last tier. But I just think when you look at their schedule and how strong it is and the potential for turnovers and sacks in those 3 games, I do think they deserve a top 10 spot. And then at number 11, the Falcons defense. Listen, I tried to put the Falcons outside the top 12. A couple things kept them in this week for me. First of all, again, you cannot ignore this schedule right here. They are playing 2 of the worst teams in the NFL. The Las Vegas Raiders and the New York Giants the first 2 weeks. Like, I can't see how I put them outside. The Raiders are turnover prone. They have the worst NFL turnover differential in the entire league. Then you get the Giants, who are in complete disarray. Then you get Washington. That's not a week you want to play the Falcons. Throw them to the bench. Throw them on the waivers that week because you don't want to play them. But again, also what kept the Falcons inside of the top, 12 this week was how they performed against the Los Angeles Chargers. Like, the Los Angeles Chargers, they lost that game, but they got 5 sacks against Justin Herbert, and that's kind of been their problem this year. They have not gotten a lot of sacks. So are they starting to figure it out? I don't know. I don't think it's a very good defense still. The only reason they're here is because of how strong their schedule is. And then the Rams defense drops to number 12. The Rams defense, I just think when I look at them, this is not a team that really looked very good against the New Orleans Saints, who, again, I thought was a great matchup here. The Rams defense has had really good moments this year in fantasy. They've also been, pretty bad at a lot of spots as well. So the Rams defense, just the way they played in the month of like October and then early November, I thought they were going to be a great defense in fantasy playoffs. That's why they were higher ranked the first time around when I ranked these defensive playoffs. But when I look at them over the last 4 games, they've not had a ton of success in fantasy. And that's because they played a couple good matchups in there, like Philadelphia was not a good matchup. New Orleans, though, this one is a stinker on their resume right here. So even though that they've been getting after the quarterback more often, and they're getting a little bit more turnovers, when I look at their schedule, when they're taking on New York Jets in week 16, I love that matchup. San Francisco, I actually really like that matchup. Arizona, that one's a toss-up right there. So the Rams defense, I just think that with their inability to maintain any kind of consistency, I can't realistically have them inside the top 10, inside the top 8 at this point, but I do think with their strong schedule and the playmakers that are evolving on their defense, I think they still deserve a spot inside the top 12. So let me know what your record is right now, and we'll make sure to keep preparing for the fantasy football playoffs.